Big news. Let's head to New York City now. Our breaking news. The defense has just rested their case in the federal sex trafficking and racketeering trial against Sean Diddy Combs. Joining us live from outside the courthouse. I would think we may have lost her due to a technical issue. So do want to talk about what's amazing. I just want to sum up is she did a hit with us not too long ago, within the last hour and a half maybe, that the prosecution had wrapped up.
Today in court, the tension was palpable as the trial reached its pivotal moment. P. Diddy, the internationally famous music mogul, took the stand under intense scrutiny, with his defense team pushing relentlessly to have the racketeering charge dismissed. It's been a grueling 6 weeks, with the prosecution bringing forward a variety of witnesses and testimonies, but now the defense had their chance to make their case. After the prosecution concluded their case, the defense team chose not to call any witnesses. Instead, they launched into an impassioned hour-long argument that focused solely on getting the racketeering charge dismissed.
And since that time, here's what we know that we can share with you. Sean Diddy Combs did address the court to say, I'm not going to testify. And now the defense has rested. No case of actual testimony presented. They were going to read some things into the record. Still with us, criminal defense attorney, former district attorney Matthew Mangino. I almost fell out of my chair. I did understand they said we're not going to present any witnesses. I'm surprised, but that was their choice. They were going to read some things into the record, but golly, that was really quick to go to the defense is done.
This was a bold move, as the racketeering charge is one of the most serious accusations. And by not calling witnesses, the defense essentially placed their bet on the idea that the prosecution's case was too weak to stand. Their strategy was simple: to show that the charges were without merit and that the evidence presented was insufficient to prove criminal intent or organization. It was a risky move, but one that could pay off if they could cast doubt on the prosecution's claims.
Yeah, I mean, it surprised me a bit, Judge Ashley. I mean, originally they had a whole list of witnesses, then they pruned that down a little bit, and then all of a sudden they're not going to put any evidence on at all. They must be pretty confident. You know, they banged away at the witnesses for the prosecution, and, you know, I think they've tried to make this case more about consent than anything else, and hey, you know, Diddy's a bad guy.
The jury now finds itself at a crossroads, as deliberations will soon begin, possibly as early as Thursday or Friday. P. Diddy, whose legal name is Sean Combs, has been adamant in his plea of not guilty. He faces serious charges: racketeering, conspiracy, and allegations of sex trafficking. These charges are incredibly grave and the stakes are high. The world is watching closely.
And we don't like Diddy, and you probably don't like Diddy, but he's not involved in racketeering. He's not involved in sex trafficking. That's not what this amounts to. So that must be their strategy.
And I do think they were smart to lean into it and even go further and say, yeah, it may have been a crime that he hit Cassie Ventura. And they admitted these are crimes. But to your point, not sex trafficking, they say, as well as the not racketeering. I want to read what Combs told the judge.
With fans, media, and the public all holding their breath to see if the celebrity mogul will be convicted or acquitted. What caught many off guard today was the defense's aggressive stance in challenging the core of the prosecution's case. Typically, in high-profile trials like this, the defense might call.
Here's what he had to say. I'm doing great, Your Honor. I've been wanting to tell you thank you. You're doing an excellent job. This is the first time I've seen these words. A little unusual, I think, for a defendant to thank the judge. And then we have Judge Submaramian saying, thank you. I appreciate it. All right, let's come out on that one, Matt. That seems a little unusual, but it might be keeping with the personality of Sean Diddy Combs.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard a lot of strange things during the course of this trial.
Witnesses to testify on behalf of the accused, to offer an alternative narrative or refute the claims made by the prosecution. But the defense, instead of playing the traditional card, chose to silence that option. By doing so, they were sending a message. The prosecution had failed to prove their case, and now it was up to the jury to decide if they were convinced. A crucial part of the prosecution's case relied on text messages that were exchanged between P. Diddy and Cassie, a former girlfriend.
You know, this doesn't seem out of the norm for Diddy or other people that we see in front of the court. You know, in some cases you're screaming at the judge and they have to take you out of the courtroom, and in this case, before a verdict even comes in, you're saying, thanks, you did a good job. We'll see what he thinks about his job after the verdict comes in.
Yeah, after this verdict. So let's talk about the two different charges. The trafficking charge, if the jury believes...
One of the texts sent by Cassie caught the attention of the courtroom. It read, "Be your little freak," followed by a request for an explicit photo. The defense quickly argued that this text was part of an ongoing relationship and didn't bear any weight in the case. They painted it as nothing more than a normal exchange between two consenting adults. However, the prosecution disagreed, claiming that these messages were proof of coercion and manipulation.
That any of the traveling, well, there was traveling across state lines. Does consent even matter? Because there were multiple witnesses who described getting all of the stuff, whether it was the drugs, whether it was the whatever product he wanted to have there, the Astroglide. They got it all to a hotel. They set it up. They transported sex workers to get there. Is that enough for the trafficking piece?
Well, I think that the prosecution in their closing argument is going to work,
aiming to show a pattern of behavior that was consistent with their charges. After some back and forth, the judge ultimately ruled that these particular texts would not be presented to the jury, deeming them irrelevant.
Backward, okay? They're going to start with this promoting prostitution. And then, you know, that's been conceded here. And then work your way back and start building on the sex trafficking and the racketeering as it relates to that transportation of prostitution, because there's nobody contesting that issue. So I think that might be...
It was a significant blow to the prosecution, as they had hoped to use the text messages as a cornerstone of their argument that P. Diddy had been using his power and influence to control and exploit those around him. However, this setback didn't stop the prosecution from making their case.
The way the prosecution approaches their closing in this case.
And that makes sense. It makes good sense. I know the prosecution is saying for the racketeering, the law says you have to have a criminal enterprise, but they did bring on different witnesses and different people, the personal assistant for the defendant who worked for him, to, add that they were involved or their piece of the puzzle. So I think arguably a jury could find racketeering. Your thoughts?
Well, I think
another key piece of evidence came in the form of a seemingly harmless exchange where Cassie mentioned buying baby oil to the casual observer. This might seem like a harmless conversation. Prosecution seized on it, suggesting that this exchange was part of a larger narrative of manipulation. The defense countered, claiming it was simply a consensual interaction between two people in a romantic relationship.
I think it's going to come down to, in this case, and I don't always say this, that it comes down to the closing argument, but I think in this case, the prosecution, they have a lot of stuff out there that they presented to this jury. They got to connect all the dots now. And if they can connect all those dots, I think working back from the promoting prostitution, they just might get there with regard to the sex trafficking and ultimately the racketeering charge.
You know, every closing argument I've ever watched, which is many, many, many in my career, I've always thought...
But the prosecution didn't back down, arguing that the context of the exchange was part of a pattern of controlling behavior, even if the actions themselves appeared voluntary on the surface. It's here where the trial started to take a more complicated turn. The legal experts present in the courtroom pointed out the nuances of consent and coercion, noting that just because someone says yes doesn't necessarily mean they are acting.
If there could just be a simpler way to spoon-feed the jury in your closing, oh, I know, a demonstrative aid. This is what the law requires, and here's what we've proven with which piece of evidence. And I think they're going to really have to spoon feed it because these charges are complex. Even as attorneys, I've read over it and over it again to make sure I understand properly what the charge says. It's a lot for the jury to decide. Let's listen to this, talking about those witnesses. I want to listen.
Of their own free will. In cases of power imbalances, which were clearly at play in this case, consent can be manipulated. The defense, however, focused on showing that the interactions between P. Diddy and his alleged victims were entirely consensual.
Two, testimony about getting drugs for P. Diddy.
After you obtained drugs for Mr. Combs, what typically did you do with them?
Either gave them directly to him or put them in his Gucci pouch.
What is the Gucci pouch?
It's just a place where we would keep drugs.
Who told you to put the drugs in the Gucci pouch?
Something I learned from former assistants.
Who did the Gucci pouch belong to?
Mr. Combs.
Where did Mr. Combs keep the Gucci pouch?
Thus dismantling the notion of manipulation. The defense also pointed to another text where P. Diddy allegedly asked if Cassie could participate in a freak-off without being under the influence of drugs. This was another attempt to paint the relationship as non-coercive, but, once again, the prosecution countered, arguing that even seemingly benign text
Kept it in a backpack, or he kept it in his room or on his person.
Which staff members, if any, handled the Gucci pouch?
Assistants.
Did the security ever handle the Gucci pouch?
Not that I'm aware of.
Under what circumstances did the assistants handle the Gucci pouch?
Just whenever he'd ask for it.
Of course, those were AI generated. Those were not the actual voices. But we now have Kelly Craft there on the ground. Kelly, I feel like I blinked.
This could be part of a larger strategy of manipulation. The question then became, could the people involved have really given their consent freely, or was there an underlying coercion at play that they themselves didn't recognize? Throughout the trial, the prosecution worked tirelessly to prove that the relationships P. Diddy had with his alleged victims were
And it went from the prosecution rested to the defense is rested.
Hi there, Judge Ashley. Yes. So it was just about 3:07 that defense counsel began presenting its case, and then it was very short. They began doing some stipulations and then reading into the record just some evidence in regard to messages that particular Cassie Ventura sent. And so I can tell you about that in just a few minutes, but I do want to start.
anything but consensual. They presented videos and testimonies that painted a picture of coercion, manipulation, and exploitation. These videos, which have not been made public, were rumored to show explicit evidence of sex trafficking, as well as proof of P. Diddy's direct involvement.
With what you were mentioning, and this was the exchange between the judge and Sean Diddy Combs. And I kind of want to show you, if I can, as to what Sean Combs was doing when he stood up and he was talking to the judge, because of course there are no cameras inside the federal courtroom. So we are your eyes and ears from inside that courtroom. So kind of talking with you about his demeanor and what he was doing. Well, we have the full screen up for you now, so I can tell you what it says. He said, "I'm doing great, Your Honor. I've been wanting to tell you, thank you. You're doing an excellent job."
In organizing and orchestrating the activities. The judge ruled that these videos would not be shown in their entirety, but their significance was clear. They could potentially be the smoking gun that links P. Diddy directly to the charges of racketeering. The prosecution's narrative began to take shape with evidence that seemed to point to a deliberate and calculated effort to control others for his benefit. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence was the testimony of Jane, one of the alleged victims. Jane spoke of how she had been manipulated and coerced into sexual situations with P. Diddy, claiming she had been trapped in a cycle of fear and control.
And the judge said, "Thank you, I do appreciate it." And when he was asking Sean, if you want to come back to me on camera, when he was asking Sean how he's feeling and if this was actually your decision, solely my decision, he was saying, he kind of like leaned in, Judge Ashley, when he was on the table. So he leaned in and then looked over at his attorneys and said, "It was my decision in conjunction with my attorney." So it was kind of an interesting moment that was inside that courtroom.
Wow, it's fascinating to hear some of those things that you get to see firsthand because, and why he worded it that way, maybe because the attorneys told him to. All right, what do we expect next, please, ma'am?
Her testimony described how she was forced into secrecy, signing non-disclosure agreements and being subjected to P. Diddy's whims. The prosecution argued that these actions were indicative of a larger criminal enterprise's systematic effort to control and exploit women. One of the most controversial aspects of the case was the use of non-disclosure agreements, NDA. The defense pointed to the fact that Jane had signed one before meeting P. Diddy in Las Vegas.
Well, so things are over for the day here in Lower Manhattan. So the things that are going to be coming up next, the charge conference, and then, of course, closing arguments that are going to be taking place on Thursday, and then we're hearing Friday. And what we're hearing now is that the jury may not even begin their deliberations until Monday. So that is what we are hearing.
Suggesting that she had willingly entered into the situation and was aware of what she was agreeing to. But the prosecution argued that NDAs in these cases were often used as a tool to silence victims and prevent them from speaking out. By signing an NDA, the victims may have felt pressured into compliance, not realizing the full extent of the manipulation they were under. As the trial progressed,
We're still waiting for some confirmation on that, but that's what we're hearing now. So definitely we're hearing that this case is going to move into next week. And then, of course, with the 4th of July holiday, things would most likely be wrapped up before then with a verdict in this case.
All right, Kelly Craft, great. Thank you for your great eyes and ears there this entire trial.